the Wednesday episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Orrin Phillips, and if you love great comic book art, then you have come to the right place. Why? Because today's guest is a great comic book artist, Mr. Patrick Olliffe. Patrick has worked on Spider-Man for many years, Spider-Girl, stuff for DC, stuff for Disney, all sorts of different artwork. Works a lot with our pal Tom DeFalco. Just recently did the Secret Wars series that came out. Absolutely spectacular stuff. He's a industry vet. He's one of the most well-respected men in the industry because of his art, and he's got some wonderful stories to tell that you're about to listen to right now. So enough of me. Here is the interview.
So last time we talked a lot about you working with Mr. Tom DeFalco about the Secret Wars story that's coming out. But we want to talk about you and your career. And let's start from the very beginning. How did you first discover comics?
Well, I first discovered comics. My dad, I remember buying me a Superman comic. I think I was probably like 6 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I just remember just kind of being entranced with what I was looking at. I mean, the colors and the drawings and everything. I think that's what kind of got me started. So I would buy more comics. I would find them in the local grocery stores or the 7-Elevens, or well, not at that point. But what I found was that I was really connecting with the drawing, the illustration, the colorful characters, the drama of all the action. And initially, I didn't even read them. I just looked at the pictures, and then at some point, someone said, "Hey, dummy, you can actually read these things." So. And then, so I just started collecting more and more, whatever I could find. I just absolutely loved the characters, loved the drawings. And then when I got a little older, a friend of my dad's, all roads lead to my father in this case. A friend of his had a copy of Avengers 93. I think that was, Roy Thomas, Neil Adams, Tom Palmer, Kree Skrull War, Avengers. That changed everything. I looked at that for hours, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I just that was really, I think, before I thought comics were kind of, as a little kid, comics are cool and fun, and look at all these great things. But then when I saw the Neil Adams work in the Avengers, that really changed how I viewed comics. And how I really interacted with them. At that point, I just became just a rabid fanatic. So that was really the beginning.
So at what point in your life do you say, you know what, this might be a career I want to get myself into?
Well, not unlike a lot of guys in our field. I was a fan of comics, and I was drawing my own, like, any piece of paper that I could find. I was drawing characters and drawing my little stories. And at some point, once again, my dad, I was probably in my, early teens, I guess, 12, 13, 14, something like that. And my dad said, there are guys that make a living doing this. I mean, and that was like, really? I think at that point, maybe in the back of my head, I thought it was like Santa's elves. It was like fairies that just kind of, they just make this stuff and out it comes. And no. People actually draw these, and they get paid to do that. And I said, that's great. So once I realized that could be something, and people were making a living at it, that certainly changed how I viewed my place in the industry, or what I hoped would be my place in the industry.
So how do you get your foot in the door?
Well, I'm in Pittsburgh. So I went to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh, which is also where Ron Friends, Paul Gulacy went. I had done a little bit of work when I was in middle school with a local animation company, just kind of some grunt work there. Ron Friend was also connected to another animation company, and they kind of worked together. And so I started showing my work to Ron, and he was very complimentary, very nice. Kept in contact through art school. At that point, he was already on his way to superstardom in the comics field. So I just kept showing him my work, and he was like I said, very kind and seemed to like it. And so at one point he showed it to Ralph Macchio. I think he was on. I think Ron was probably on Thor, probably about that time. Ralph seemed to like it, but kind of put it on the shelf for a while. So in the meantime, when I was finishing up art school, I just started sending out samples of my work, getting all my rejection letters. I got a bite from the brand spanking new Malibu Comics. So they asked me, if I was interested in drawing one of their books. I was just about ready to graduate art school. I thought that was tremendous. So I started doing work for Malibu, Eternity. In the meantime, still sending out artwork to different publishers, and my work was still sitting on that shelf at Marvel. And then probably about a year or so later, they needed somebody to draw Tales of Asgard in the backup feature in Thor. And so I guess Ralph pulled the work out and said, "How about this guy?" So I said, so they gave me a shot at it. And really that was the beginning. So I was able to do some Tales of Asgard stories. Did a couple issues of fill-in issues of Thor. And that really kind of got me in the door. So it was Ron basically showing my work to Ralph. Sits on a shelf for a little bit. Then they give me a shot at Tales of Asgard, gets a couple fill-ins. And then the regular artist position on Nomad became available. And the editor walked into Ralph's office and said, "Hey, we need an artist for Nomad. Do you know anybody?" And Ralph said, "How about this guy?" So they said, okay. They gave me a shot. So my Nomad was my first regular work at Marvel. And that's really kind of what got me going.
So Malibu at the time, they were sort of up and coming. They're trying to compete with, the bigger guys. Was there a lot of hands-on at Malibu at the time, or were you kind of left to your own devices?
No, pretty much left to I worked with Tom Mason, Dave Olbrich, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think one of the first books I did was called Stealth Force with Bill Spangler. And I think we might have been Malibu's first book or one of their first books. So at that point, these guys were from what I understand, these guys were putting this company together on their back porch. Right. And I was basically drawing it in my mom's basement. So we were all just kind of making it up as we went along. That was really early in that phase. So, Malibu, Eternity, that was super early. So they really weren't. It was during that period where there was the kind of the black and white comic glut. There was a ton of black and white comics just coming out. This would have been probably, late 80s, 88 maybe. Yes, I'm that old. So there was just a lot of work at that point in the black and white industry. So I was able to get work at Malibu. They weren't competing. They were just trying to keep their heads above water at that point, as was I.
Right. So you get to Nomad, which was a book that Marvel, they were trying to push a good amount. They were looking at him as sort of a young, sort of future star in the stable. Right. What were your thoughts on the book, and did it have that same potential to you as you were working on it?
Well, I think it did. I think it did have that potential. My thoughts, to be honest, were, I remember Nomad from Captain America, and so it was fun to work on that character. But at the same time, when you're on your first book at Marvel, you're just so excited to have work and to be working at Marvel Comics. I still remember the first time I filled out my Federal Express form to send pages to the office, and I was writing Marvel Comics on the airbill, and I thought that was the best thing ever. So at that point, it was less. I didn't have the wherewithal to have a more global view of the character and its place in Marvel or what they thought he could be. My job was just basically, oh my God, I have to draw these pages and I have to try to do the best job I can. I have to meet my deadline. At that point in my career, I was not really looking at the big picture. It was more just like, don't screw this up, you moron.
That's always good advice. Yeah. Now, being a young artist there, and with this book, were they sort of giving you a lot of direction as to the look they wanted, the feel they wanted for the art, or were you kind of given sort of free reign on that?
Yeah, so there was some instruction in the sense that the artist that I followed, they didn't necessarily want me to draw like him, but there was a certain way that the pages were laid out. I mean, when I was drawing Thor, that was still me trying to get used to superhero comics, because for the year prior, even though I was a fan when I was younger, for a year prior, I had been drawing things like Stealth Force, which is a spy book, a Frankenstein adaptation. I did no superhero work for probably a year and a half. So when I got into Thor, it was kind of like, how do I do this again? How to refamiliarize myself with that kind of storytelling. So then we went to Nomad. Again, that was late 80s, early 90s. So the image guys were having their impact in how pages were laid out and how images were kind of conveyed on the page. So there was an effort at that point to be aware of that kind of style, where you would have big images on the page. You would kind of be able to move the eye around a central large image. So there wasn't necessarily an edict in that way, but there was kind of an idea that I would try to keep stylistically, in terms of page layout especially, kind of close to what had already been done before I showed up.
You kind of you did bring up a very good point that you were doing a spy book and then you get to Thor. As an artist, this might sound silly, but how do you create the muscle tone on the character to make it so he's not that big, but he looks like a superhero and moves like a superhero without being too bulky?
Well, that was a struggle for me for a little bit, because I had spent, like I said, almost a year and a half or so just drawing regular people in regular clothes. Obviously, I was a fan of superhero comics when I was younger, but I had not been drawing that. And so when I showed up and of course, the guys that I was a fan of, I mean, Neil Adams, Jim Aparo, those guys had more slender physiques in general. So that's kind of what I did when I first started showing up doing work on Thor. Then he looked skinny. I mean, Ron was doing these great dramatic, larger than life figures. So it became how to work the musculature. I had to get the characters bigger and more dramatic and more bulky. And if Ron sees this, he will understand what I'm saying. So I did go through a period of time where, in order to make the figures, I realized that my characters weren't dramatic enough, and I need to kind of bulk them up, especially when I got on to Warlock and the Infinity Watch, and I had to draw Drax and that kind of thing. So I did go through a transition period from my more slender, Aparo-based, like normal people style, to try to bulk up to the more heroic characters. So I did go through a period where I got the bulking up figures correct, but for some reason I didn't actually enlarge their heads at the same proportion. So I go through a period of time early in my career where I'm struggling to get these characters to be larger than life, dramatic superheroes, but they have all these tiny little pea heads. So that was a little strange. So eventually I kind of wised up and I figured it all out. But that was just kind of a work in progress. And really that was looking at the guys that I was a fan of. I mentioned Jim Aparo, but also guys like John Buscema. I watched what Ron was doing. John Byrne. I was a huge John Byrne fan. So watching how these guys were able to handle the musculature and the dynamics of the figure, that kind of helped me kind of start to kind of reset what I think the characters were supposed to look like.
When you move from an Earth-based book like Nomad to a space book like Warlock, it seems like the characters were a little more dramatic. You had more flowing capes. You had a lot of action going on.
Absolutely.
How did you sort of make that transition as well?
Well, it really, the Warlock book, it wasn't that difficult because I was a huge Warlock fan, and I just absolutely was bonkers for that book. So one of the highlights of my career was after I did the Thor Core miniseries with Tom DeFalco, the ever-present Tom DeFalco. They needed somebody on Warlock and the Infinity Watch, and I actually got a call from Jim Starlin offering me the project, which was, that was like my geek brain exploded at that point. So in terms of handling the flowing capes and the space, the Warlock environment, kind of the more space-based environment, that wasn't necessarily that difficult because I just pulled from not only the books that I had, because I still had a lot of those books, but also from my memories of what the of the book, what Jim Starlin did. So that wasn't that difficult. I kind of had a jumping off point. When you're doing Adam Warlock, doing Warlock and Infinity Watch, of course I've seen what the guys were doing previous to me, but for my own kind of direction, I just went back to what I was a fan of, the Jim Starlin stuff.
This is sort of an odd question, but you're at Marvel, you're a young artist, and you'd mentioned the Image guys were starting to take off.
Right.
When you were there, was Marvel looking for the next breed of young artists to sort of step up and take their place after those guys have taken off?
I think there might have been some of that, but I wasn't privy to that kind of conversation. Again, that was more, it was more, there was a nod to a stylistic approach to how pages were laid out. And how you handled like you needed a big image and the kind of the more splashy image style. Then there were certainly some guys that also would like imitate the style, the specific penciling inking style as well. But nobody actually, from that specific standpoint in terms of the penciling inking style, no one said anything to me about trying to look like that. It was more just kind of how pages were laid out. Now, in terms of them trying to groom the next superstar, I'm sure they would be crazy not to. That would make perfect sense. But as I said before, at that point, I'd still only been early at Marvel, and I was just kind of doing my own thing, hoping that I would stay employed. So, yeah, so I wasn't aware of anything beyond that.
Another question is,
I'm a pretty basic guy.
I think you're a superstar. I mean, come on. But when you get into Malibu and Marvel, was that the first time other people were inking your work?
I'm sorry?
When you got some Marvel and some stuff with the Malibu, was that the first time people were inking your work?
Yeah, because when I was doing work at Malibu and Eternity, I inked my own work. So when you got to Marvel, I tried inking I wanted to ink my own work because I enjoyed doing it. I really wasn't that good at it, but I enjoyed doing it. So one of the first books that I got a chance to do that was on the Tales of Asgard. So I inked some of those myself. And then I got to ink the Thor miniseries. But in doing so, I found out that the problem was you had deadlines to meet. These things had to come out. There was a schedule to keep, and I was way too slow to kind of keep that going. So I wasn't able to finish inks on the Thor miniseries. I tried inking when I got Warlock and the Infinity Watch. I made a pitch again. Can I ink it myself? Because that's what Jim had referenced. He had seen some of my work on the Thor miniseries, and he liked it. So I thought, well, I'd like to ink my own work. Craig Anderson, the editor at the time, said, sure, we could try it. But once again, I was just not fast enough, especially at that early stage in my career. I just wasn't fast enough to do it. So then you start bringing in other inkers. Some work and some don't. And I think I ended up working with Keith Williams on, I think Bob Allman did some inks over me on Warlock. Then Keith Williams did some inks over me, very stylistically different. So most pencilers, especially early on in your career, you don't have a lot of choice. An editor says, hey, you have this job? I say, great. And they say, I'd like to ink it myself if possible. And they say, no, because you're not fast enough. But I don't get to pick my inker. They look at the pencils and they have inkers and they try to match them up. And sometimes, like I said, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So that was kind of something that you had to kind of get your brain around as you move forward.
As you got through older in your career, what are you looking for in an inker? Like, what is, skills that you think works best with your pencils?
Well, I think the first thing that makes a great inker is that they can draw as well. They don't have to, they don't have to be tremendous at it. but a good draftsman as an inker makes a huge difference. And I've been very fortunate to work with guys that have drawing ability. I mean, everybody from Tom Nguyen to Scott Koblish, and I just Tom Palmer, obviously, Al Williamson, clearly. That's the first thing, is if they can draw, then they're going to be a good inker. Stylistically, when I ink my own work, I tend to have a looser. I was a huge fan of Bill Sienkiewicz and Klaus Janson. So when it comes from an ink style, those are the two people that have influenced me the most. So I like that kind of looser, scratchier style. So I tend to look for inkers that can do that, that have some life to the line, have some kind of some guts to it, some scratchiness to it, that kind of thing. So I'm really, that's what I would prefer. But to me, the bottom line is, if they can draw, then they're going to be an effective inker.
I want to talk about some specific projects in a moment, but I'm always curious, as an artist, are there certain either issues or books you worked on that you can sort of see your evolution as an artist, that are sort of milestone points that you're like, oh, okay, this is when I discovered this and my art changed a bit, and then it keeps growing from there?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, there are times when I think my work has taken jumps. I try not to look back at my early work too much because it's too hard to look at. But I think one of the jumps came at Untold Tales of Spider-Man, and really that was primarily because I knew that I was going to get a chance to draw Spider-Man. I was going to get a chance to draw Spider-Man in that era. And I knew at that point my work, I was drawing these big superhero guys and, like I said, Warlock and the Infinity Watch and Thor. But I needed him to be more wiry and more animated as a figure. So I looked at guys like Rick Leonardi to see how he handled the character. But that, I remember starting on the first issue of Untold Tales of Spider-Man and thinking, I really have to push the kind of the animated feel of this character, to get Spider-Man to twist and move in ways that are physically impossible, but I really had to try to push that. And just have fun with it. I think that was a big step in terms of handling kind of a more animated, fluid, bendy kind of a character. That was one. And then there's little pieces along the way. I did Marvel Team Up. I remember Marvel Team Up. Spider-Man teamed up with the New Mutants, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I remember working on it. Al Williamson was inking it, and there was just something about the way that things were starting to click with me. And I remember even Al mentioned it. He said, "Wow, you've taken kind of a jump here." So, and then after that, there are not. I think Spider-Girl was a jump for me as well. I look at the work that I did on Spider-Girl. Those first 2 years, I think is some of the best work I've done. And the same thing, I jumped again, I think, with Catwoman. When I was on Catwoman at DC, I look at those. I was recently looking at some of those work, some of the pencils for that, and I think I took another jump. So the thing is, over the course of time, you can have little markers as you go along, and you find out, okay, I took jumps here. But in reality, whatever jumps you take are, at least in my experience, are much more subtle. And you can really only see them when you look back over the long period of time, over a long run on a book or a several year period. You may have those markers, but the changes come, like I said, in my case, more subtly over time.
How long did it take for you to feel that you belonged in the industry, that you made the right choice and this is where you belong? Or is it just one of those things
what time is it now? I don't know if I don't know. I mean, to be honest, maybe Untold Tales of Spider-Man. But as a freelancer, I guess I don't. I guess the idea of feeling like you belong, the feeling that you feel like you belong happens when you finish a project and an editor recommends you to another editor, and they get it, and you get work that way. When editors are all aware of your work and say, yeah, this guy is dependable, he does good work, let's give him more work. So you feel like you belong when you are in that mode where editors are handing you around and say, hey, recommending you, that kind of. Outside of that, as a freelancer, I don't know if you ever really feel like you belong. You're always, when you're finishing a project, there's always part of you that goes, oh my God, do I need to put my, fill out an application at Wendy's? I don't. So there's that piece of it is always there.
So Untold Tales of Spider-Man comes along. How is it pitched to you, and how are you feeling about taking over the franchise character?
Well, it was huge. I mean, it was amazing. And I think I got the job because I had done some trading cards for Tom Brevoort, trading card series for them. And I'd done Spider-Man on a couple of them. And I came into the industry having a fairly traditional style to begin with. Excuse me. And so he saw the work I did on the trading cards, liked it enough, asked if I was interested. I said, absolutely. I did a little sample piece. And what they seemed to like, and gave it a thumbs up, and we were off and running. So how I felt, I was intimidated, but I was also super excited because I had not drawn Spider-Man at that point in my career. I was still early in my career, and I knew this was a big character. And the theory around the book, weaving the story in and around the pre-existing Lee Ditko stories, I thought was amazing. And Kurt just did a beautiful job. And so every time that I would get a script, I was reading it like a fan would read it. I said, oh my, so I was very excited from that standpoint too. But as I said earlier, I also felt the pressure to not do what I had done on Thor and Warlock and Infinity Watch. I couldn't draw Spider-Man like he was Drax in a Spider-Man costume. So I had to make sure that I had to really look at Steve Ditko, look at Rick Leonardi, and make a focused plan on how I was going to change my approach to handling figures on this book. So it was super exciting. I was thrilled. I loved the idea. And I was also, intimidated too.
You just mentioned looking at Ditko and Leonardi's work. What did you want to bring personally to the character? Was there any sort of look or any sort of change that you wanted to make sort of your own style to the character?
I think that there wasn't a conscious effort to say, I'm going to bring Pat Olliffe to Spider-Man. It was more, I knew what the story was about. I knew the direction of the book. I knew what the influences were. I looked at some Ditko, looked at some Leonardi, and basically you kind of mix that all up in your brain, and what comes out is combined with what my own intentions were. And basically what comes out is, who I am at that moment, all the influences I have, because if you look at Untold Tales of Spider-Man, I never looked like I was drawing with a Steve Ditko style, or looked like I was drawing with a Rick Leonardi style. So it was kind of more of a combination of influences. And then through me, that's just kind of what came out. There really wasn't a conscious effort on my part to say, I'm going to, this is going to be the Pat Olliffe Spider-Man.
Who is your Spider-Man artist? The one that you say, that's the Spider-Man artist that I consider the best.
Well, that's that's a little too difficult to hone in on one. Obviously, Ditko was who I looked to originally for Untold Tales of Spider-Man. I mentioned Rick Leonardi. I was a big fan of John Romita and John Romita Jr. as well, and Ron Frenz. He's you can't really get better at Spider-Man than that guy.
So Spider-Man, then you move to Spider-Girl with Tom DeFalco.
Sure.
Talk about, I know we had you guys on before, but that was a long run for you on that book. What worked so well with you and Tom?
Well, I think at that point, Tom and I had worked together quite a bit. With the Thor villains and the Thor Core miniseries, and so we were familiar with each other. But also, I think stylistically, I was, like I said, I showed up in this industry with a fairly traditional style, a fairly traditional approach to the storytelling, which I think fit very well with how Tom likes to tell a story. So I think he felt comfortable with me. I felt comfortable with Tom. So there really wasn't, and that was the nice thing about Spider-Girl. There really wasn't, I mean, obviously we had What If 105 to jump off of. Right. And I was obviously looking at what Ron had done and what those guys had created in What If. But there really wasn't like a getting used to each other period on Spider-Girl. We were familiar enough with each other. We'd worked together in the past. And so we kind of hit the ground running pretty quickly.
Did you think the book had as big a potential as it wound up having?
I would love to say that I was thoughtful enough to say, yes, this is going to run for 12 years or whatever it ended up running. I don't think anybody, not me, not Tom, not Ron, nobody ever thought that that was the way it was going to run. I think clearly when what Tom and Ron came up with 105, spun off into A Next and, all the MC2 stuff, clearly what Ron and Tom came up with was unique enough that it struck a chord with people. So they captured lightning in a bottle there. So you kind of knew that you were on something pretty special, and you got a chance to kind of play in a universe that was uniquely your own. But can I say that I knew that was going to happen? No. Did I think that she was a special character? Yes, I did.
Now, are you starting to get more and more recognition from fans with that book than maybe previous books?
At that point, to a certain extent. Now, Spider-Girl, the amazing thing about Spider-Girl was that at that time, most Marvel editors had kind of an algorithm of, a book was going to sell this number as a first issue. It's going to lose half. You'll be done by this issue. But we never did that. We had our peak, and then we dropped as was expected. But then we never left. We like flattened out, and we never dropped really below that. So, but those numbers, we weren't like a huge seller necessarily. So in terms of my recognition, yes, that was some of it. But to be honest, even though we didn't sell huge numbers on Untold Tales of Spider-Man either, most of the people that recognized my work still at that point were probably coming from Untold Tales. And then as time went on, you're on a book for 5 years, then Spider-Girl, then yes, at that point, Spider-Girl was how people knew me.
I want to talk a little bit because you've done some children's books as well.
For Disney Publishing.
For Disney Publishing.
Yep.
What do you change your artistic style from the comic book Pat to the Disney Pat?
Well, not dramatically, because the reason I was able to become Disney Pat was because I was Marvel Pat. So I got the job because Mike Seglain, who I'd worked with at DC, was in charge of Disney Publishing. I guess it's Disney Press at that point, and they were looking for artists. Most of the artists that they were hiring were artists that were in the Disney house, and they would do like nothing. There's nothing wrong with this, but they would do like the fairy books or Peter Pan and that kind of thing. So when they would do this, when they got the Marvel properties, they would do the Marvel books. They really weren't looking like Marvel heroes. And Mike, coming from comics, he knew this. And he said, boy, these just aren't quite looking right. And I had reached out to Mike, and I had kept in contact after we had worked together at DC. And he said, could you draw like a Spider-Man head, just a head, a Spider-Man, Peter Parker? And he didn't tell me why, and send it to him. So I did. And he took it to his bosses and said, so this is what they're supposed to look like. So it was that kind of traditional superhero Marvel DC background is what they were looking for to a certain extent. So, but the stories we told were for a different audience. They were going to have painted colors over top of my pencils. So there was a certain openness to it. There wasn't a whole lot of line work. There was a certain kind of I had to be even more straightforward with the storytelling to make sure that the point got across in a few images. We weren't doing panel to panel storytelling. So there were some changes that I had to make, kind of small changes. But I didn't really have, they wanted the characters to look heroic. And so I basically just kind of kept them in that direction.
I want to talk a little bit about drawing the female form, because you've done it so well with Spider-Girl, with Catwoman, and you see a lot of books in
She-Hulk. Don't forget She-Hulk.
She-Hulk, yeah. You catch what I see a lot of things. Then it's either they're so top heavy, other artists, I'm saying, they're so top heavy, and then this skinny little body, or they're just gigantic. How do you do it so well, and how did you get to that point?
Well, I think I think it's to be honest, I think it's character based. I mean, I think now there's certainly the beginning is my traditional approach. I mean, I'm looking at guys like, I think one of the best artists to ever draw women is John Buscema. So, but I'm looking at guys like John Buscema, Neil Adams, like I said, Jim Aparo. None of those guys are necessarily over the top gratuitous in how they handle the female figure. So that's my training. So I show up with that kind of more traditional approach, and then it's kind of character based. Like She-Hulk was a bigger character. Now I didn't get too gratuitous with her either, but then she's different than how I would draw Spider-Girl. Spider-Girl's a teenage girl. She's going to have a thinner figure, more athletic figure. So you want to do what's right for the character. So I think that's part of the same thing with Catwoman. I probably made her a little bit more curvy, a little bit more sexy than obviously Spider-Girl, because that was the Catwoman character. Right. But my traditional training basically didn't I didn't go over the top, because that's not how I viewed it. That's not how I was trained in it.
Right. So talking about going to DC, how did that jump occur, and what were some of the differences between, Marvel and DC?
Well, I had been at Marvel for years, and I loved a lot of the DC characters, would have loved to have worked for them. But just could never get in. I would just, for one reason or another, editors, either projects weren't available, editors didn't like my work, whatever. But I was just having a really difficult time trying to get work from DC, but I was fine. I mean, I was getting a lot of work from Marvel at the time. Eventually what happens is, as it happens in this industry for a lot of guys, is who you know and connections you make. So Steve Wacker was assistant editor, I believe, to Pete Tomasi at the time. Now, Pete wasn't necessarily a fan of my work, and that's fine. But Steve was. But as an assistant, he really wasn't in a place to hire me. So when Steve became an editor, I reached out to Steve, and he was able to start getting me, I got a fill in on Firestorm, and then was able to do, then I got involved with the 52 project. That was through Steve. So it just kind of, once you have an in, and once you have an editor that likes your work and wants to work with you, then you start getting work. And then it's the same thing in a way that happened when I started at Marvel. I started getting work. Steve then went over to Marvel. He left, but Mike Seglain was his assistant. So Mike Seglain started giving me work, and I started doing work for him. Did the Four Horsemen miniseries, and then eventually started doing work for Mike Martz, who I had worked with at Marvel. He was a Spider-Girl editor for a little while. Now he's at DC, and I did a Batwoman fill-in for him. And from there, that's how I got Catwoman. So it's that kind of thing. Once you get a reputation, and once you have an editor or editors that like your work, you're dependable, and know you're not going to screw up too bad, you can find work that way.
I want to talk a little bit about DC in a moment, but you had that long run on Spider-Girl. Would you, and it seemed like for a long time it was a long run on the comic book was a wonderful thing. That's what artists
Absolutely.
wanted. And then it sort of changed
Absolutely.
a little more recently where I only want to do 6 issues, then I want to jump to this and do
Right,
this. What's your
right,
mindset
right,
on
right.
all that?
Well, my mindset is again, because I'm old.
Mhm.
My mindset primarily is similar to what it was when I was a kid collecting comics. I mean, I like to know that every month I was going to pick up my favorite comic and my favorite writer and artist were going to be on those books. I mean, long runs. Like I said, John Byrne I was a big fan of John Byrne. So you would see these long runs, X-Men with Chris Claremont, and then Alpha Flight and all that, Fantastic Four. So all these longer runs. That's kind of what I knew as a comic book fan, and that's kind of what I wanted to do when I get into the business. And I think that was one of the things that led to the success of Spider-Girl, is that every month they knew that Tom DeFalco and I would create a story, a Spider-Girl story, that hopefully they enjoyed, and they knew that the next month we'd be back and we'd tell them over, and that kind of comfort that a reader gets with a creative team can only happen if you're on for a long run. Now and then Ron, he goes on, he goes for 6 more years. The same thing. They knew that Tom and Ron were going to be there every month telling a Spider-Girl story. So I understand the industry kind of is different, and deadlines can be an issue. You certainly, if you have a longer lead time, if you're only do 6 issues and you have a long lead time, you can spend more time on the pages. You can do that kind of thing. There's a certain amount of work that you have to do to meet a monthly deadline for 5 years. So, but that's what I grew up knowing. That's what I wanted to do. Is that, the books that I was on, everything from Warlock and the Infinity Watch to Catwoman, the Scooby Apocalypse. I mean, I got on those books with the hope that, even though the industry had changed, with the hope that 5 years later, I'd still be drawing that book. And that was always kind of what my mindset was. That was just kind of how how I liked it. That's what I did when I was a fan. I followed, my favorite book and had my favorite creative team on them.
As an artist, how do you know when it's time to move on from a book? Is there a point that you hit, or is it just one of those things?
I think it's in my career. I've not had the opportunity to get tired and say it's time to move on. A lot of times these projects end with decisions outside of my power. So, but I think over time, the closest I've got to that feeling on some projects are when you when you start to feel too repetitive, where you feel like there's really nothing more I can say here, nothing more that I can do here. I can't really explore this anymore. I can expand this anymore. I've done everything that I can do with this character and on this run. So the work is getting stale. I'm getting stale. It's probably time, unless I can find some way to reinvent myself or reinvent the character or my approach to it more specifically. That feeling of staleness is probably an indication that you should probably move on.
So, New 52, kind of a divisive thing amongst fans. Some folks really liked it. Some folks weren't too crazy about it.
Sure.
What were your thoughts on the project, and how was it approached?
I thought it was nuts.
There you go.
I liked. I mean, to me, I thought it was a very, it was, it was an ambitious project. Let's say that. So I understand some people didn't like it. I liked it. I thought it was a great idea. I thought I was amazed that they were going to attempt it. It was an enormous amount of work, and I'll tip my hat to the unfortunately recently departed Keith Giffen, who I've worked with several times. That was very sorry to hear about his passing. But he kept the 52 trains running because he provided layouts for all of us. He was the guy that made that work. So from a story standpoint, I thought it was a cool idea. I thought it was worth exploring. From a from a deadline standpoint and from a work production standpoint, I thought it was crazy. But it certainly, you know, you had a team of rotating guys. I think when I was brought on the book, I think that we had 4 teams of like regular guys and then fill-ins, guys who would fill in along the way. And you would just, you know, you would get layouts from Keith and you would just go. So it was fun. It was a fun project.
I say, did you like that structure of sort of the rotating teams, or was it sort of like you just didn't know what you're going to get one time to the next?
There was a little bit of that. It was difficult because there was some coordination, obviously, that had to go on with what someone else was drawing and what you were drawing. Keith made that all much smoother because he was in charge of a lot of that stuff. I loved working on some of the characters I've never, like Booster Gold, and never got a chance to draw him before. And so there were a lot of characters that I got a chance to draw for the first time. That was super fun.
Right.
But it was a strategic challenge. At times that did pose an issue when you had to try to coordinate with whatever people were doing in terms of reference, what this guy drew. But the nuts and bolts of it, the structure of it, the skeleton of it was Keith Giffen. He made it all work.
You know, as you mentioned, he sadly just passed away recently. Some thoughts and stories and memories about him?
Well, you know, Keith, I loved working with him, and I love talking to him on the phone too. He is he's quite the character, as anyone who's ever talked to him knows. Just a super funny guy. I unfortunately don't have a specific story, but I just you know, he was this kind of, at times, this very kind of curmudgeonly kind of guy, but had just, you know, wonderful stories. He'd been around a long time. He'd done tremendous work. He was a legend in the business. So we just talked just not only about the stories we're working on, but things that he had worked on, and you know, those were great conversations, absolutely great conversations. So, and I remember when we were talking, well, we were on Scooby Apocalypse, and we had talked about, I'd hope that we would just kind of continue, that would be a longer run. So, but unfortunately it wasn't. But yeah, he was a tremendous guy, absolutely tremendous guy. Loved working with him.
Did you ever see him smile?
No, of course I never actually met him. I mean, it was
okay.
all, I know, I never met him at a convention or anything. So I understand that you had a better shot of seeing Bigfoot than you did seeing Keith smile. So, I have seen neither. So.
You said Scooby-Doo Apocalypse, taking a legendary character and, you know, sort of bringing a different tone to the book.
Yeah, very much so.
What did you think when it's saying, like, we're going to take Scooby-Doo and we're going to make these changes? Are you saying what, or are you all in for it?
Well, I was aware of the book. The book had existed before I showed up. So I was aware of the concept, and I thought it was great. I mean, I remember describing it to somebody as like Scooby-Doo meets The Walking Dead kind of thing. Yeah. So, excuse me, I love the idea. So when they offered, basically what happened was they had me do a fill-in. What I didn't know is I think they were going through an art team transition at that point. I had done a fill-in, and they liked it enough. They said, how about we just make you regular on the book? I said, tremendous. So, but I love the characters. Obviously, I was a fan, you know, Scooby-Doo when I was a kid. And I love, like anybody, who doesn't love drawing zombies? So, but I thought it was great. Love the book. Well, I would have loved to have just sat on that. That's a book I would love to have sat on for 5 years. I could have done that thing forever. Then the fun part was my daughter was pretty young when I was drawing it, and I remember I had one of the pages on my drawing board, and she came in and she went, "Oh my God, it's the Mystery Machine!" So that was kind of cute. So, but yeah, that was. I love the concept, love the book. Would have loved to just stay on there forever.
Is there a character you've yet to work on that you're dying to get your hands on?
There are, yeah, I mean, there are some characters that I have drawn little snippets of, but I've never been able to do long runs with the characters. I think Captain America is one of them.
Right.
I've drawn Captain America in different projects, Last Hero Standing, that kind of things. But never had a chance to draw the book regularly. Captain America would certainly be one of the characters. I got to draw Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman in the Four Horsemen miniseries. I would have loved, that was great to draw those guys in the miniseries. I would have loved to draw those kind of classic characters, Superman, Batman. I would love to have a longer run on those characters as well. I mean, I'm a fan of those kind of, I mean, I got to draw Hawkman, so that was a classic DC character. I got to draw the Atom, a classic DC character. So I would, so, I mean, there are certainly some characters out there that I have only got a hint at them and would love a longer run on them.
Does the kid in you ever look back and say, "Oh my gosh, I just drew Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, Captain America"?
Oh yeah, I mean, there are times when in this business you have to produce a large volume of work quickly, especially like when I was on Spider-Girl. I mean, you got 5 years of every month you got to have the book out. So there's a certain amount of kind of like you put your head down and you just draw. But there are times when you pick your head up and you look at it and say, "Oh my God, I just drew Spider-Man. I just drew first time I drew Adam Warlock. I'm drawing Adam Warlock." I mean, so yeah, there are oftentimes it's not as like I said, you kind of get stuck in the grind of just, okay, I got to turn the work out. But you do want to take a moment and pull your head back and say, this is what I'm doing. And this is the character I'm drawing. Character that I loved when I was a kid, I now get to draw. Those moments, those are great. Those are great.
What are some projects you're working on now that fans can be looking forward to?
Well, November 22nd, Secret Wars Battle World comes out. So I recently just finished up work on a creator-owned project I did with Chuck Austin called Edgeworld, which came out through Comixology Originals. Our second series just came out. It's collected through Dark Horse Books, and I believe that should be coming out shortly. So that was the first time I got to work on a creator-owned project, which was great. I'm hoping we get to do more of that. I have a couple other things that I don't think I'm allowed to say anything about right now. So, just have to say, whenever news happens, I'll post it on my social media sites. But yeah, I have a couple of things coming up that I'm really excited about that I'll mention when the time is right, so I don't get in trouble.
And we are back. Yeah, Pat's a very cool guy. Personal story, I got to meet him at Terrificon last summer. This is before we set up the interviews and stuff like that. Speaking to him one-on-one, such a nice person. I got a sketch he did of Spider-Man, which he signed, which is up in my son's room. It's one of my son's favorites, so he'll always have a near and dear place in my heart. Again, as we say with all our guests, love to have him back just because I think Pat has so much more to tell us. But man, his art is just phenomenal. If you're not familiar with it, Google it, check it out. An amazing artist, and so pleased that he took the time to speak to us. So again, thank you so much, Pat. Thank you guys for listening. Remember, rate, review, subscribe, tell your friends. Let's really get this thing moving and going. We got so many great stuff building up for 2024, and I think you're really going to love it. So thanks so much for watching. We'll talk to you soon.